The trout are getting stocked and the weather is warming up, which can only mean one thing. It's spring trout fishing season. So to help you get prepared, I've got 10 spring trout fishing gear tips. What is up, Outdoor Mavericks? Welcome back to Herman's Outdoors, where today we're going to talk about spring trout fishing tips, and in particular we're going to talk about gear specific tips that you're going to use and help you get ready for the spring trout season. Now, some of the reasons why I love spring trout fishing is you've got stock trout opportunities, you've got holdover trout from the fall and the winter that have grown up really big, and you've got more areas to fish in the springtime after the snow melt. But to be successful trout fishing in the spring, it all starts with your preparation, and in particular, your preparation with your gear. And that preparation starts out with tip number 10, which is to clean your fishing reels. Now, if you're a hardcore trout fisherman like myself, you put abuse to your reels, whether you drop them in some mud, some sand, they might fall out of your hand, they get banged up in the car, and as you go through multiple seasons, you want to make sure that your gear is clean and ready to go for that spring season. So starting with the reel, the first thing you want to do is clean any mud or sand or debris off the outside of the reel. Just make sure that the line is clean and there's not sand and stuff getting in there that can hurt the fishing line. And something that you definitely want to do is to make sure you've got your reel all lubed up with some reel lube. Make sure it's moving nice and smooth, make sure all the components are nice and lubed up, and that you've got a really good, smooth, fast reaction, because that's going to be the best way to reel in the big ones. Now, tip number 9 has to do with bait, and that's checking to make sure your bait is still viable and still fishable. And for some anglers, that might mean that you've gone a season or quite a while without fishing with, say, power bait dough or eggs or even power eggs, any of those dough type baits. And one of the things you want to check with your jars is to make sure that they're not dried out, they're not like moist and wet inside, or you just don't have eggs that have gone rancid, because baits do have a shelf life. They will go bad. Like ProCure scents in the container go bad about 5 to 7 years after you buy them off the shelf. So one of the things that you want to do in the springtime before you head out is make sure that all your baits are still viable. Now, tip number 8 is something that you can do on a wet, cold, rainy day, on a day that you're not heading out to the water to chase trout, and that's to do some e-scouting on your phone or your computer at home to find new areas to fish, maybe some new sections of the river, or go explore and see if there's some new bodies of water that you've never fished before, and figure out where to go and how to fish them. Now, by using your phone before you go out fishing, you can find some new areas to fish, but also mark some areas on the maps that might be of interest to you. And then once you get out into the field, make sure you flip your phone open and mark GPS locations of where you're fishing, or maybe you find some of those new secret spots. Mark those on the map. One of the best ways to learn some new areas or learn some new fisheries is to just mark some X's on the map, get out there and just go fish. Now, tip number 7 is something I take very seriously, and I do this every single spring, which is go to the store and gear up on all the essentials in the store. One of the things I've learned over the last couple years, especially in my local area where I shop and go to get my fishing gear, is there's some items and some baits that run out of inventory very quickly, and you have a really hard time finding them in the store or having to pay double the price online, which I never want to do when I'm buying fishing gear. One of the items I always run out of is bait holder hooks. So I make sure anytime they're in stock in the store for the sizes I want, I'm grabbing multiple packets. And one of the things you have to be really careful of when you go shopping in the store is to grab the packets of hooks off the shelf. And one of the scariest things that I've ever done in the store is I grabbed a packet that had some treble hooks in it and accidentally hooked my finger in the store and started bleeding all over the aisle. And yeah, the manager definitely freaked out. And yes, at the end of the day, she did give me a discount for my troubles, but it was some scary stuff and it was a mess. Gear tip number 6 is to actually test your gear out before you head out to the water. Now, if you're a bank fisherman and say you got a new rod, a new reel, or some new gear to try out, go to your local park and get some, just cast in and go cast some gear out into the grass and just get used to your different gear setup. And this is something that's great if you've got kids and want to get them learning how to cast, but also if they've got a new fishing rod or a new reel from Christmas and haven't got out yet, go give it some cast out at the local park and get used to your your different gear. And then if you've got a boat or a kayak, get out there and get a fishing trip in. And even if you get blanked and you're just practicing using, say, the electronics, the new trolling motor, or the new boat or vessel that you have, make sure that you know how to utilize all those things. Now, tip number 5 is something that cost me one of my best days of trout fishing ever, so I recommend that you do this gear tip, which is to make sure and fix any holes in your net. And I say this jokingly because a couple years ago, I had this really raggedy net that I fished with throughout the entire season, and at the end of the winter season, when I started to ramp down the trout fishing, it actually got a hole in it, and when I went out that spring, I forgot that the hole was still in the net, and I hadn't repaired it. So the first day I went out in the spring, I hooked a massive trout, and you guys can probably guess what happened next. I got it in the net, it slid through, did a little head shake, snapped the line, and it was gone. It would have been my personal best trout at the time when I was trying to learn a new technique and how to trout fish, and I was ready and so excited when I netted that fish and just went through the bottom and bloop, the line broke and it was gone. So before you head out, make sure that your net doesn't have any holes and any gaps in it, or that big one may slip right through your fingers. Now, tip number 4 is something I am doing consistently, and it might be a little bit from my OCD, and that is to make sure that my tackle box is cleaned out, cleaned up, and very organized before the season starts. Now, one of the easiest things that you can do when you're out fishing is moving stuff around and just getting a really clustered and really disorganized tackle box really quickly, especially if you're moving stuff around, you're trying to grab stuff, you're putting tag ends in there, you're emptying your garbage and just adding it into your tackle box to make sure it doesn't fall into the water. And your tackle box can get messy really quickly. So make sure before you hit the water that you've got your tackle box cleaned up, you've got any stinky scents that might be in there cleaned up with a little lemon joy, washed out, everything dried out, put your gear back in there, and then you'll be ready to go and hit the season hard. Now, tip number 3 is one of my favorites, and that's to make sure that your tackle box or your organized boxes are organized by species that you're fishing or by the body of water that you're fishing. Now, one of the things that I've been doing with my tackle organizers over the last couple years is having a couple that are set up for, like, say, small ponds or big lakes or rivers or streams, maybe more flowing water, and having those organizers set up with baits and gear that I need for that body of water. It's much easier for me in the morning or the night before to set that aside, make sure I've got the right tackle gear set up and ready to go. One of my biggest snafus a couple years ago was I grabbed some of these to head out to the lake. Unfortunately, I grabbed the bass gear instead of the trout gear and had to hoof it all the way home and all the way back out for that day of fishing. And because I didn't have them organized, I didn't have the right gear set up. Now, tip number 2 is something that you need to pay very close attention to when it comes to your gear, and make sure that you're changing it out and swapping it out frequently, because it could be the biggest difference between failure or success when it comes to trout fishing, which is to make sure you get new line on your reels. Now, when I did a poll on the channel recently, a lot of you guys commented and said you don't change out your line very frequently, or maybe every 6 months, maybe even a year or a couple of years. Some of you guys do it more frequently, and you guys are the ones that definitely fish a lot. But if you're only fishing a few days a month, even if you're not a hardcore trout angler, you need to make sure that the line on your reels is getting changed out pretty frequently. So depending on if it's mono, fluorocarbon, or braid, you need to swap out your line pretty frequently. And in the springtime, before the season starts to pick up, is a perfect time to make sure you got new line on your reels. And having that new line on the reel a lot of times can be the biggest difference to make sure you don't lose that trout, and even those big trout when you encounter them. So now that we've gone through tips 2 through 10, what's gear tip number 1? Well, pretty simple. It's to have fun in the process. Preparation for the season could be a lot of fun, but also a great opportunity to teach others, like your kids or your nephews or your neighbor down the street. Get other people involved, help with the organization, make sure you have fun with it, because when you have fun with the prep, it leads to a lot more fun out in the field when you hit the water and land and hook that big one. And there you guys have it, the top 10 spring trout fishing gear tips. Hope you guys got some great information from today's video. Smash the thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and as always, you guys, the outdoors is a gift, share it with others.